McGill is a writer of speculative and historical fiction. Born in Scotland and raised in North Carolina, McGill is the author of the novel Our Hideous Progeny, and their short fiction has appeared in Fantasy Magazine and Strange Constellations. You can find them online at C_E_McGill. CE, whenever you're ready.
All right, so I'm going to be reading from Our Hideous Progeny, which is my spin-off of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein about Richard Frankenstein's great niece who decides to follow in his footsteps and prove that women can be unhinged mad scientists too. Prologue. Could you, said the inspector, run it all by me one more time, Mrs. Sutherland? I took my time in answering. I paused to smooth out my skirts and steady my breathing, to survey the room, single grimy window, the awful narrow wood-panelled walls that gave one the impression of being trapped inside a cabinet. I do not consider myself an expert in lying by any means, but if there is one thing I have learned on the subject over the course of my life, it is this. Lies cannot be rushed. They must be spun evenly and carefully. Too fast and you risk tangling up the details. Too slow and it sounds like a stage performance, scripted from the start. And so, despite my racing heart, I paused. I already laid it all out before the magistrate this afternoon, I said, and the constable before that, not to mention Mr. Wilkinson and... Yes, well, the inspector squinted at me rather reproachfully through his pince-nez. A man is dead, Mrs. Sutherland. We must make sure we record every detail. I'm sure you can spare just a few more moments of your time. I looked down at my hands, at the bandages wound around my palms and up my wrists. 4 small red crescents bled through the fabric on each hand where my nails had dug in. Of course, although this part I could not bear to take my time over, though I suppose that was all right, as it was not a lie. Would you make a note, sir, that I plan to go by my maiden name in future, in case you need to find me in London? The inspector paused, his pen poised above his notebook, and raised an eyebrow. And what would that be? Frankenstein, I replied. Mary Elizabeth Frankenstein. It was a grey and foggy March day when we brought it to life at last. I had expected there to be thunder, or at the very least some rain. I had expected that, on such a momentous occasion, nature would have been obliged to provide us with a fitting backdrop. But evidently, nature felt that she owed us no favours, as the morning dawned dull as always, wreathed in a thick mist that dampened clothes and sound alike as it crept over the hills. I took a measure of grim satisfaction in Clark's bedraggled appearance as he let us into the boathouse. He'd come to us bright-eyed and brimming with confidence. Now, in his rumpled shirt-sleeves, with grey shadowing his jaw and the skin beneath his eyes, he seemed but a dim reflection of his former self. Henry, meanwhile, outshone us all in his morning coat, the same he had worn on our honeymoon in Lyme, and which had shown the dust of the chalk cliffs so badly. Perhaps he was hoping to make a good first impression. We examined our instruments one final time, the bellows to provide the breath of life, the stove in the corner to drive the spring chill from the room and make its cold flesh warm again, the beakers of elixir upon the work table, bubbling merrily on their burners. I measured out a vial and handed it to Clark to administer. Then, having nothing else to do, I leaned in close to the creature and laid a hand gently upon its neck. Is it warm enough, Mary? Henry asked. I nodded, startled to hear his voice. The room had been so silent before, as still as a church mid-prayer. We had built here in this half-ruined boathouse on the edge of the Murray Firth, a temple to our own strange gods, to chemistry and anatomy and electricity. There was an acrid smell in the room as the procedure began. The air felt prickly and sharp, bursting with potential, like the moment before lightning strikes. But there was no bang, no flash, no grand transformation, only something dead one minute and alive the next. Its flippers twitched, its great curved back began to rise and fall of its own accord. And its eyes. I will always hold dear to my heart the fact that I was the first to see those golden eyes open, to see its reptilian pupils narrow and focus on my own. For in those eyes I saw for the first time proof that we had created something truly alive. But that isn't right. No, I'm getting ahead of myself. That isn't really how it all began. And then I'll read just a little bit of chapter 1 as well. Ours was a house of mourning. She no longer took delight in her ordinary occupations. All pleasure seemed to her sacrilege towards the dead. Mary Shelley, Frankenstein. It began, rather, with a black-edged envelope. It must have been late afternoon when it arrived, for I remember the slivers of sunlight that cut the room, casting each mote of dust in gold. Most of the time, the study was caught in the looming shadow of the opposing tenements, but for one glorious hour each day, the sun shone in and turned the air to honey. Caught upon every gilded title on the bookshelves, lighting up my polished ammonite like a mirror. It was a subject of constant debate between the two of us, whether the curtains ought to be left open or shut to prevent the books from fading. Evidently, however, I had won that day, for it was through a haze of that rare London sunshine that I watched through the doorway as the envelope in question slid from the letterbox and landed, with a gentleness that did not match the gravity of its contents, onto the checkered hallway floor. At first I simply stared. It was my grandmother, most likely. Her nurse had written the previous month to say she had developed pneumonia and was not faring well. I wondered for a moment whether I could simply pretend I hadn't seen the letter, if I could sit and continue my work in peace for another hour or two, until James brought us the post before supper. But then I remembered, as I had been remembering in jarring stops and starts all week, that we had given James his notice, as we could not afford to pay his wages until Henry found steady work again. And I remembered, too, that Mrs. Jempsetji had been ill earlier that month, with a persistent cold that would not cure. I looked down at the half-finished illustration upon my drawing desk, the stem of a fossil fern, Equisetum columnare, the specimen itself resting in my open palm. I had been holding it up to the light, trying to catch every detail of its petrified surface. Now I was gripping it so tightly my knuckles were white. With a heavy heart, I set it down and rose to my feet. That is Our Hideous Progeny. I was going to give away today as part of the giveaway probably the new paperback, which actually just came out yesterday in the UK, as well as a little bookmark and these signed book plates, which I had printed for some reason. They're cute though.